Good evening, everyone. We'll be getting underway very shortly with the Equine Industry Symposium.
All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Thursday session of the first ever virtual Equine Industry Symposium. This is the 5th annual symposium hosted by the University of Guelph. The EIS was created to encourage different equine sectors to work together despite division between disciplines. The event is hosted by the Bachelor of Bioresource Management students majoring in equine management as part of our degree. We have 5 students hosting and moderating the session tonight. Our MCs for the evening, Caitlin Graff, and myself, Emily King. Our Q&A moderator, Tiana Evans, our technology moderator, Alessia Massini, and our evening timekeeper, Leo Shia. We would also like to remind you of the netiquette expectations of the evening. Please mute your microphone and turn your webcam and camera off to prevent any sound or connection issues. If you have any questions, please utilize the Q&A function on Zoom and not your microphone. Our Q&A moderator will manage the questions. Please also understand that while we try to answer as many questions as we can, we may not get to all of them. This session is also being recorded this evening. This is to allow people who were not able to attend to also watch the symposium. You can find the recorded sessions on the HORSE portal, and the link should be on the screen. This year's overall equine industry symposium topic is resilience, restructuring, and thriving from COVID-19. Throughout the week, there have been a variety of specific topics and discussions. Our first session on Monday discussed how the pandemic affected the equine industry and what issues and opportunities arose from COVID-19. On Tuesday, we discussed planning for success and structural essentials for business operations. Yesterday, we discussed pandemic pressures on equine welfare. On our final EIS evening tomorrow, we will be discussing pandemic positives and the silver lining from the COVID-19 situation. In tonight's session, we will be discussing traceability and emergency preparedness in the equine industry.
The Equine Industry Symposium is also an active supporter of the For the Herd emergency fundraiser. For the Herd is a campaign that provides support to riding school horses during the COVID-19 pandemic. As we all know, many riding schools and lesson programs experienced months with no lessons or students due to COVID-19. For the Herd has provided assistance to many riding school horses during these uncertain times. You can donate to For the Herd using the link on the screen.
We also wanted to let everyone know of the EIS raffle. Since you're attending this event, you're all automatically entered in our raffle for an abundance of prizes, such as a 1-hour trail ride at Conestoga River Horseback Adventures, 50% off an equine first aid course, gift cards, and for a saddle fitting session, just to name a few. If you also choose to donate to For the Herd and provide your email, you'll receive an additional raffle ticket for our raffle draw. All winners of the draw will be drawn over the weekend and announced on Monday, November 23rd.
As our final note, we wanted to provide some information about Equestrian Canada Coach updating hours. If you're an EC certified coach, you can receive 1 updating hour for each evening session you attend. To get your updating hours signed, fill out the updating hours form and submit to the email you see on screen.
Now finally onto the symposium. Joining us this evening from the United Kingdom is Equine Register Chief Executive Stewart Everett, who will be speaking about traceability and the horse ID implementation in the UK. Red Wings Horse Sanctuary's Head of Behavior and Welfare, Dr. Nic de Brauwere, who will be discussing the benefits of traceability, and Equestrian Canada's Manager of Welfare and Industry, Kristy House, who will be speaking about traceability in Canada. Before we begin with our speakers, we would like you to ask yourself a few questions just to think about regarding biosecurity and traceability. So how is your farm prepared for emergencies? How biosecure are your practices? And are your horses accounted for?
Starting off our evening is Stewart Everett, founder and CEO of the Equine Register in the UK. The Equine Register is the leading provider of national identification, registration, and traceability services to the equine industry and the governments in the UK. Stewart has spoken at a variety of equine events, such as the National Equine Forum, to discuss how the UK Central Equine Database and the Equine Register can improve animal welfare and improve overall traceability. Now, without further ado, please help me in welcoming Stewart Everett.
The introduction covered off what we do in the UK, so there's no need to go onto that. But essentially, national identification, verification, lifetime traceability services, they're all about enabling people to make good decisions really quickly in real time. And that depends, it doesn't matter which stakeholders you're talking about. It's about linking people together and sharing data really quickly, and enabling people to conduct their business and conduct their statutory requirements really easily and effectively, which will then support, hopefully, equine welfare, commerce, the whole breeding, everything that you need to do there. We provide the Central Equine Database in the UK. This the mandatory database that looks after all the central core information is a legal requirement, and it has, we'll come on to how many records and things it has in a second, but essentially it is fed into by statutory bodies, the passport issuing organisations, stud books, people like this. And there is access for vets, various other people around the outside, and with a number of the other services. Now, one of the things we also do is we provide the data management and insights for the livestock services in the UK. And we currently work on cows and pigs and sheep, which are multiples more information. I think there are 60 million records there that go back in some cases up to 30 years. Is huge bodies of data that we manipulate and move around and give people connection to. But actually equine's where we started, and hence our name, and it's also where our heart is truly. And equine are the most tricky of all, because they are both pets and food, and they move around and they do loads of different things. And actually they have a load of activity traceability requirements that you need to start to bolt in. So the CED in the UK has the information from 81 passport issuing organisations. In our case, most of those are stud books. In the UK government gave permission to 81 of them. That's very, very unusual that any country in the EU or anywhere has that. I mean, we are by far the biggest number of passport issuing organisations feeding in data. We have 750,000 to 800,000 owner records and around about 1.5 million records of equines on the CED. It is a requirement for all equines to be on there. We can only guess this is roughly about right. And actually we're going through the process of starting to make that more and more kind of ensure there's more coverage there. We also have, there are 13 passport issuing organisations that have ceased to exist that we still manage the data for because they have passports out in the marketplace. The idea of the system is it's fully integrated. And this is really important because you will hear a lot of people talk about how they have something that does this much of something that vets need to use, or something that grooms need to use, or something. It's absolutely fine, wholly appropriate, but actually what you need is the full join up of everything that you've got going on in order to move the data around really fast. You want people to be able to not have to fill out forms endlessly, not have to fill out information, the same information repetitively. Number one, it causes human error. Number two, it is a bind and nobody uses it. And number three, it doesn't actually help with getting you the information you need in real time. You also want to be able to show the information in a way that is relevant to the person using it. For example, a borders official does not care who the fourth previous owner of the horse was. They just want to know, is it the horse it says it is it vaccinated, and is it allowed to go that way or that way? And that's all they care about at 4 o'clock in the morning when it's pouring with rain. So it's about getting the data to the right people in accordance with data protection laws, in accordance with everything else, and in accordance with what they need to do. Now you'll see down the left-hand side there some of the applications that we provide in the linked up kind of integrated system and platform. These are just a taster of them, as are the groups around the outside. There are a load of groups that aren't on there that are also covered as well. And these groups get bigger and bigger and bigger. And the system itself enables other third parties to integrate with it and share information in a secure fashion. Now, one of the other things that it does, we've got one of the big kind of questions was, is it compliant? Is it this? Is it that? Of course it is. And it works with EU member states. It works under EU law. And in spite of the fact the UK is leaving the EU in not very many days' time, we are always going to be governed by a number of those laws. And that would be the benchmark we would set at in order to trade with the EU. Now, I know Canada has done deals with the EU as well. And there will be a requirement as you're moving equines backwards and forwards to meet those base standards. We tend to pick the highest standards anywhere we can and put the systems across, and that includes supporting welfare, supporting vets, supporting whoever needs that done, but also supporting the industry to do the things that the industry wants to do. One of the things we're very proud of is what we're starting to do with research. We've just signed a huge deal in the UK, but this will be rolled out across the world. There's some work that's going on with a join up between a number of member states at the second and international states to do traceability and cross-border movements. One of the things that the research enables you to do, because of the way that we collect the information and hold the information, is that researchers typically have a real problem getting large cohorts. Sometimes they can get 100 horses, 100 people, 200 people, whatever, but they can't hold on to them for that long. Because we've got 750, 800,000 owners, thousands of keepers, vets, everybody on there, we can get 50,000 people, 20,000 people, 2,000 people, but we can hold them for 20 years, 30 years. So it enables really good stuff to be driven back and information to be brought out of PhD studies, given back to the horse population, and to see what happens, try and test it, and actually start to drive benefits to the animals on the ground. If you look at what lifetime traceability is, I spoke, we had a warm-up session about this a couple of days ago just to try and work out what we were going to talk about, and somebody said, I think you should actually cover this off. You want to cover from the time the animal is born, and you want to, it's about identification of the animal and the owner and the keeper. You've got vaccination status, you've got medicine status, actually, you've got food chain status, disease status, movements, you've got forwards and historic, and I'll show you how some of that works with the system as well. Contact traceability, who else have they been in contact with, and also death. But the other thing that we cover is genomic and ICSI traceability as well. This is something we're starting to bring in because there are a number of requirements to start to trace genomic products before the animal is born, so that you can follow it straight into the life flow. Now, with the life flow, you've got a need to keep changing ownership. Horses in the UK are bought and sold on average 5 times. The national herd changes hands regularly. You've got all this transactional stuff going on at the low end and at the high end. And actually, you need to keep a track of what's going on in order to keep the whole herd safe. Now, if we come on to some of our products, what I'm trying to show you here is not so much that there's a load of products. So these are only a few of them, but this is the integrated services that start to drive traceability. Now, we've talked about the central equine database. That is very much holds the core data. It's a mandatory and statutory requirement for the UK government to have that in place. But you've also got now the digital stable and the chip checker. This enables owners, keepers, loanees, farms, liveries, the whole 9 yards, to keep information on their horses and their equines, and to start to put where they're kept, vaccination status, microchips, everything is registered against it. They can report them missing, they can report the out of the food chain, etc., etc. And they can also change ownership with it, not from a spying point of view of who's changed hands, how much it's cost, any of that. Not interested. More, the animal has ceased being their responsibility at this time and started to be their responsibility, and the records of the animal follows the animal through. So then you come on to the smart card. That is essentially the digital manifestation of the digital stable on your phone. It has the location of the animals, it traces movements, it does cross-border work, it does tickets. You can share that information, you can report it missing, you can do all the things there. That is like having a driving license for your horse. It is an absolutely verifiable document that is utterly secure. All your horses sit on there, all branded by the stud books, all verified, all real time and up to date. But you've also got the fact it's a communications platform. It's really important if we've got verified veterinary information on the system. So vets have verified that the animal has been vaccinated. We know where the animal was when it was vaccinated. We know who the vet was. We've checked with the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons in the UK to make sure the vet is a vet, the vet is allowed to practice, and the vet hasn't been suspended since the last time they logged in. So you've got the opportunity, if there is an outbreak of a disease, influenza, strangles, whatever it is, to start to target messages and to say things like, in the first instance, there's a disease outbreak in your area, you are vaccinated, but you need to do X, tell your friends. The second scenario is you're not vaccinated, you should do ABC, go and contact a vet, get vaccinated, and we can trace back and see if the messaging is working. And then the third one is the kind of doomsday scenario. The strain has jumped the vaccinations, you think you're vaccinated, you're not actually vaccinated, you need to go and get vaccinated with these particular brands of the vaccine or do whatever you need to do. And that can help make decisions really quickly on the ground when it comes to tracing what has to happen to shut things down. So then we come on to event tickets. Important thing about event tickets and pre-event registration is you do not want the animals attending the event if they're not vaccinated. This system is integrated. It shows event owners, they can set the minimum bar. They can say if it's Pony Club locals, okay, we're happy to accept the animals vaccinated maybe, or they can say at a national 5-star level, we want independent veterinary verification. All this will only trigger tickets during the time and all that kind of thing with the traceability in it. We know who's going to the event. We know which people are in the trucks, which horses are in the trucks, and we know that the events can manage the entry and exit of these animals in a biosecure fashion and who they've come into contact with. So then we come on to the digital ticket. That is the other end of the manifestation of that piece. The ticket's stored within the smart card. People can come up and scan it, and immediately you've got a track that those animals in that truck past that point at that time, went in there, came back out again. They may have crossed paths with these animals, etc., etc. And you've got the opportunity to start to build a traceability contact network if you need to, and if the worst should happen and a disease outbreak should follow at some point. You then come on to the veterinary app. The veterinary app is an incredibly sophisticated piece of kit that enables vets to do biometric markings, fill out European style passports in real time. They can do all the stuff with food chain, vaccinations, microchips, adding alerts, adding movement restrictions, adding disease restrictions. They can identify equines, they can rule out a food chain, they can do the whole piece on here. And this is really important piece of kit because this allows the vets it allows, from the traceability point of view, the vets to be a key marker and target for us and giving us independently verified information. So then we come on to the high health certificate. That is very similar to the tickets, but it enables people to pre-book their horse across, or pony, whatever, their equine, across borders with all the high health status information in there. You can attach blood tests independently verified by labs. You can attach vaccination records independently verified. You can even attach DNA. You've got something that can then be sent out and pre-booked through using the international hub. And the international hub works with governments and it enables animals to be booked across the borders. This will become particularly useful after Brexit. And it will start to enable people to move their animals as seamlessly and frictionlessly as possible between integrated jurisdictions. This is an incredibly important piece of kit because it enables governments to do things like this and start to trace backwards. You will have all seen heat maps, you will have all seen the film Contagion, you'll have all seen everything else. The fact is you now have all the data in there, and if the worst should happen, you can start to throw rings around really fast around the farms, around the holding sites, wherever you need to be, even around the competition arenas, to say these areas are closed, these animals are quarantined, these animals aren't, this can still enable movements, these have to be shut down. And you communicate through the whole system to them. You can also see who's vaccinated. You can start to see which animals have crossed paths with which animals previously within incubation periods of a disease. And you can start to make really good, really quick decisions and target your response really fast at a national level. It also, in Canada, it's really interesting for us. In the UK, we're so bunched together, we don't have a lot of space to shut stuff down. In Canada, you guys have the opportunity to shut great chunks down without affecting other places quite easily. And that's something that's quite a lot of interest in starting to look at how to do that. The last thing is that we'll talk about today is the ticket manager. This enables people at the events to set what their minimum requirements are, and it enables the people on the ground to scan the tickets in. It keeps them COVID safe, it's distant, it can swap by Bluetooth, by scanning, however it needs to do. And it can mean that people aren't touching each other or swapping bits of paper around, but they are starting to move animals in and out. They can start to broadcast to the app. They can start to say things like the north gate is flooded, come to the south gate today. They can start to say your time has changed, come into the arena at this point, wait in the holding site at this point. Everything is about smooth flow, frictionless flow, biosecurity, and no stress of animals in the back of trucks. And that essentially is my very, very fast gallop through what we've been up to in the UK. The only other thing that I can add to this, if there's time left, is that what's been really important in getting this moving and off the ground in the UK is a combination of a number of factors. Good people coming together with clear vision and objectives. There's people like the British Horse Council, the policy team, the political will. There's a lot of very, very cool people that we're very lucky to have in the right places now who are backing a common vision on this. There's our independence in the middle of it. We are not wedded to one group or fiefdom of people in the equine industry. We sit in the middle of it and we do the right thing for the whole herd. We've got we have find a way of bringing everybody with us, and that's really important with the British Horse Council and everybody else. And you've got to have product design led by stakeholders. It ensures buy-in and relevance. It's not enough for us to tell people what they need. We need to work with them, and all our applications are developed with representatives from all walks and all demographics of each one of those stakeholders, which is why they're incredibly effective. It's also a combination of mandatory core data and optional services that sit on the top of it. So these are the things you have to do. We're going to enable you to do those as quickly and painlessly as possible to comply. These are the things you might want to do, or these are the things you're telling us you want to do. The other thing is to make a start. Choose some things, make a start, iteratively develop and release. Don't try and do the whole thing at once, because no one will ever get it started. Just make a start and get the whole thing there. And then protect the whole herd. It's really important. Don't just concentrate on racing or competition or all these things. All the animals coming together and being looked after and protected is what protects all the animals. And it sounds ridiculous, but the equine world is very guilty at times of focusing very much on little groups of animals. And when you look at how many animals are out there, you realize that the ones that are famous, the ones that are seen on television, the ones that the layman knows about, count for 5–10% of the national herd. You have to be looking after all the animals, and that protects everybody. And that is pretty much it for me. And I'm happy to take questions afterwards. I hope that was useful.
Thank you, Stewart. That was a great presentation. And as a thank you for speaking, the Equine Industry Symposium has made a $50 donation to For the Herd in your name.
Thank you.
So before our next speaker presents, we do have a poll question for you all to answer. It should be popping up on your screen right about now, and it's just, is your horse microchipped? So if you could take a second to just answer that. So it looked like most of you said that you didn't have a microchip in your horse, so these presentations should be very interesting for you then. Thank you again to everyone who participated. We would now like to introduce Dr. Nic de Brauwere from the Red Wings Horse Sanctuary in the UK. Dr. de Brauwere graduated as a veterinary surgeon in 1991 from Onderstepoort in South Africa and has worked at Red Wings Horse Sanctuary for more than 27 years. As the head of welfare and behavior at Red Wings, Dr. de Brauwere leads a team that specializes in the rescue, rehabilitation, and long-term care of feral, unhandled, or mistreated horses. Dr. de Brauwere is also the chair of the National Equine Welfare Council in the UK. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Nic de Brauwere.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, evening to everybody. And thank you, Stewart, for really covering so much ground of what's started from probably the most endless debates amongst horse people about how everything around horse identity is rubbish and everything's wrong and finding solutions was never on the agenda. And out of that, you've achieved a huge amount, and we've been the beneficiaries of that already in the last while. So thank you very much. I'm going to talk hopefully with a little bit of relevance to Canada in the sense that I have some experience of what the systems in Canada might look like, but it's a very superficial understanding. So what I'm going to hopefully do is talk through the UK and the Red Wings experience and see how that works for maybe drawing some parallels with the future that Canadians could go down in terms of seeing the benefits. One of the things I just like to do really is pick up from what Stewart was talking about at the end, in terms of actually not just talking about welfare, but talking about what a database can do to benefit owners and their horses. So my day job started off being a vet. I now head the team of welfare colleagues and the behavior team at Rethinking Horse Sanctuary. And I also work with colleagues from other charities on a collaborative group called the National Equine Welfare Council. So when we talk about welfare, I've put the slide in really to recognize that although I'm passionate about welfare and a lot of other people are very passionate about welfare, it's not automatically a term that people embrace from the rest of the horse world. Some people find the conversation around welfare directly insulting, either because it seems to be suggesting that when you talk about it, that there's a question mark over their own standards of care. Yeah, so basically the issue that I'm sort of trying to touch on here is that people's understanding of the term welfare can be very personal, and sometimes people find it quite just upsetting or cause them to disengage from conversations when you make links, particularly when you suggest that there's a flaw or a gap in the way that people approach the welfare of their own horses or the horses that they work with professionally. And you only have to see that when you look at the forums that horse owners engage in, when you talk about trouble with racing, the defensiveness that comes from people from the racing world and so on. And when you try and change the conversation to terms like responsible ownership, they can also have that similar connotation. So I think when we're talking here about the benefits of a central equine database to horse welfare, how we talk about it, I think, is really important if we want to get traction. So we know that there's a need for owners to change their knowledge and their attitudes, maybe not in a huge amount at all levels, but as our understanding of horse needs and horse welfare progresses, then we would hope that all horse owners and professionals would take that step forward into the new knowledge and adapt and change what they do. So there is always going to be a need for change, which is a difficult process. So I think there needs to be changes at an industry level where there are gaps and perhaps systematic errors in how an industry is run, which leads to disease or welfare risks for the horses. And then talking about individuals and group levels. So maybe a discipline, maybe a community, maybe a local riding school where improvements could be brought in. And I think it's really important that we try and come up with approaches to these challenges by working with the people that we want to see change rather than forcing it upon them. So I think, again, Stewart alluded to the fact that if you just introduce a database with all the bells and whistles, you're going to get very little engagement from the horse community that you want to get that engagement from. And to some people, when you start talking about trying to professionalize the area of horse ownership, it's the exact opposite of what they are into their horses for. So if you're seen to be spoiling the fun, you're also going to get very little traction. So in terms of the situation in the UK, owners are also not very receptive to being told what to do, fiercely independent, and their horse is their domain and their thing, and so they don't want to be told how to look after it. And on the other hand, we do know from surveys that have been done that actually the understanding of welfare standards amongst horse owners is actually quite low. So an appreciation that there are codes of practice is low, and an understanding of the content of the codes of practice is actually low as well. So there are opportunities where we can educate and inform horse owners about evolving welfare knowledge. When there are concerns for the welfare of horses, any interventions that we want to have that are going to be effective need to be timely and evidence-based. The timeliness really means that the earlier you intervene, the more likely you are to get a successful outcome without having to bring out the big guns of prosecution and removing horses. The other thing is that if you do get to situations where you have to go through the legal process of going to court, you really want to have the evidence behind you, because your evidence is going to be tested. And ultimately, if it's evidence-based, you're also likely to come up with good solutions that are going to work for those horses, which is what your ultimate goal is. So in the UK, we're lucky in that we have flexible legislation So it allows us to not only intervene when things have reached the worst state, but also to start intervening if needed at the earlier signs of welfare compromise. That allows us to take a more balanced and proportionate approach to enforcement, and we'll cover that in a minute. But it also means that you can take these other factors like the circumstances of the owner, their financial barriers, their knowledge barriers, their ability to do the stuff that needs to be done. You can take all of that into account when you're working with these problems at an early stage. So when we talk about welfare, I think it's sometimes interesting to see how people vary in their understanding of what it means, which complicates any conversation you're going to have about it. And ultimately, it's really quite simple. It's really how well the horse is coping with the world in which it lives. And that can be positive, as in it's doing really well, and it can be negative, which is what we tend to get exposed to when we talk about welfare work and working in the charity sector. From the horse's perspective, though, it's really, it's important, to say that this is really ultimately welfare is, the judge of whether welfare is good or bad is the horse. And we are only really trying to second guess for them. And it's not really our opinion that matters. So in most horses' circumstances around the globe, they are domesticated, and therefore the welfare that they enjoy is entirely dependent on what humans either do to them or for them. And here we have a classic example of the kind of acts of violence towards horses, which are abhorrent, but perhaps easier for people to agree are unacceptable. And then we have welfare compromises that arise from neglect, where people don't do the bare minimum that horses require. So what, therefore, do we want to see improve, either in the UK or internationally? And what I think is really interesting when you look at these images is that there are very unique circumstances in each part of the world that probably need their own set of circumstances and issues to be addressed. But there are also commonalities in terms of the basic needs of horses are pretty universal. And I think this slide for me illustrates the challenges of when welfare pressures start to force an industry to close. It doesn't always solve the problem, because it sometimes just shifts the problem or the activity to another country. So one has to always think of one's welfare interventions in a broader sense and be mindful of the unintended consequences when you bring about interventions. So just in a little summary of the UK law and practice to show you the flexibility, we have these two levels of compromise under the law, which is the unnecessary suffering, which I think in Canada you will identify with. Most legislation around the world tends to work around that kind of language for the extreme levels of suffering that animals endure. But we also have what in the UK has commonly been talked about as likely to suffer, where animals' needs are not being met. So there's a degree of welfare compromise, but it may not be at that level yet where people agree that it's suffering unnecessarily. In the UK, we have the opportunity, using legal means, if the evidence is there at the time of the examination of the horse, to remove the animals and then to collect evidence, and then you have a duty to take that to the courts. If you don't take it to the courts, you have to return the animals. So if you do want to ultimately deprive an owner of those animals, you have to go to court, where the judges actually decide if someone is guilty or not guilty. Whatever your opinion is, your job is to provide the evidence, and the courts will make that decision. And then if someone is found guilty, they might find that the animals are confiscated from them. In other words, you don't return those animals. They might get a ban, they might get a combination of those, or they may get other punitive measures against them. It's also possible that whether they are found guilty or not guilty, the animals may well be returned to them. So quite often you'll find that in the UK, we also have discussions with owners about whether they ultimately want the animals back, because sometimes they are willing to sign them over to the charities, because actually at the end of the day, the reason they got into problems was because the animal was too much for them, and they would actually prefer not to have the responsibility anymore. But it's not always guaranteed. So it's one of the complexities of the work that we have to deal with. But in the end, only about 1.5% of all the complaints that came into the RSPCA in 2016, and this is a fairly consistent figure, tend to end up going to court, which would suggest that over 90% of the problems that are reported to the RSPCA where there is a concern get dealt with using other means. And in truth, that is exactly what happens. So almost always where there's a welfare compromise, it's dealt with by giving an owner advice, and they either follow it or ignore it. And if they ignore it, we can bring in more compelling means, which is to provide them with a warning notice, which if they don't comply with it might be an offence, like in Scotland, or it could then be used in evidence when you do end up having to go back to court. And basically nearly all of the cases are dealt with on this side of the table. So when we do go to court, it's usually very rare, but those cases are pretty serious, and the evidence therefore tends to be quite compelling. So pretty much all of the cases that do go in front of the courts tend to be proven against the person, and so the animals are protected at that sort of extreme end. So what are the critical elements for us here in the UK? So we've got this animal welfare legislation, and we are able to work with owners to improve animal welfare. But we also have been finding that we are struggling to identify the person who, under the law, would need to be the one that you have the conversation with or the one that you prosecute. So we've got animals that need help, but we can't prove their ownership. And if we can't prove that, the legislation suddenly finds itself at a loss. And so we had to bring in the UK an emergency valve of legislation, which we called the Control of Horses Act, which allows you to take animals into possession, even if they're not suffering, but if it appears that they are unwanted. And then if no one comes forward for them, you have the legal right to take them into your ownership and keep them, sell them, euthanize them, put them into somebody else's care. And that's been something which has been a unique sort of consequence of the way the legislation in the UK works and the way the UK industry operates. And so without that, we were really finding ourselves swamped with horses that were in this no man's land of ownership. And the real big problem here is actually ultimately the inability to connect owners to horses for us to be able to have those conversations with them, which may or may not lead to a prosecution. But at the end of the day, this is where everything for us seems to start. So what blend of improved legislation does Canada need? I think you need to look at all of these aspects to understand whether or not you've got the right things in place in order to be effective in protecting horses at all stages of their potential compromise. So one of the things that we are quite keen to see happen is where we get this sort of increasing overlap between knowing who the responsible person is, whether that's the owner or the keeper of the horses. So even if the horse is kept at another yard, if it's out on loan, if it's a racehorse under the care of a racehorse trainer, that we know who we need to speak to if there's a concern about that horse. And then that allows us to also intervene at that earlier stage, which will reduce the amount of frustration, the costs, and the kind of emotional turmoil that happens to people when you come to going through the courts. So one of the things that we feel was long, in coming and absolutely central was a functional and working database. So this is really the third attempt in the UK to come up with a way of tracing horses. And the previous two efforts failed, I think, for all the reasons that Stewart has identified what one should be doing weren't done first time round. So having this tool in our toolbox now is potentially going to change the dynamics for us in the UK. One of the tools that we've been using in preparation for this system to come in is to actually reach out to various communities of horse owners where identification has been poor. One of the ways we've done that is to engage with the horse owners through initial building of relationships with a few sort of index people within those communities, whether it's a leader or somebody who is more communicative that can be the gateway into a community. And in doing that, we have, for example, worked with the British Horse Society and other charities to get over 1,000 horses seen in 2019. 480 of those were castrated, where vets volunteered their time to do this. Owners paid a nominal fee, so it wasn't just free. But at the same time, those horses were identified, and if they'd already been passported, then the passport was adjusted into the new owner's name. And we would find other ways of increasing that sort of engagement with the owners. Farriers would come and talk to them about hoof care, because we know a lot of these owners trim their own horses' feet. And using these basic hooks that owners are interested in to get them to talk to us so that we can learn about them, learn about their horsekeeping habits, and also introduce them to the benefits and the legal requirement to have passports if they want to be able to sell their horses, for example. by giving one-off treatments, we're also directly improving the welfare of those horses at the time. And to be brutally honest, we often learn some really good tips about how these communities look after their horses, and usually come away recognizing that those horses enjoy a pretty good welfare as well. So it does then tend to change the perceptions from the welfare sector towards these communities, and helps us therefore have a much more level platform on which to have conversations and relationships with these people. And so opening communication with owners for me is really the biggest win out of all of these activities. And therefore it becomes a learning opportunity for us as well as an education opportunity. One of the things that we would hope to see from this is that the central database actually becomes populated accurately, so that the horse is actually not just microchipped and registered, but that the owner is part of that process, that the new owner is always recorded. And I think this may come up in the questions at the end that Stewart can answer to, how we're going to get there. So what parallels are there with how life is for you in Canada and what we have? I think ultimately outreach projects are a way of understanding who the communities are. We've recognized in the UK that these hard to reach horse owners are not a single group or have a particular identity. So it's not always a particular race or a particular activity of horse sport that is what the problem lies. It's often something that tends to be either related to localized issues in terms of access to land, where people can keep their horses. And because in the UK, often the presumption is that we're talking about gypsies and Romanies and travelers. A classic example here is that the sale of horses online these days has created a whole new problem for us in terms of people getting involved in horse ownership with very little experience. So horses being given away to home for free, buying them online without seeing them, without having the vetting done, means that we have a new group of owners who don't understand what their horses need, and therefore end up creating welfare problems we have to address. So if they're unprepared, and if they're outside of mainstream equine education because of how they get to find out about horses, we have to find other strategies to reach them, to provide them with the information they need. And ultimately, when you find these sort of circumstances, one of the things that's crept up in the UK is that people are buying horses and keeping them in environments that are not traditional horse environments. And so they have problems arising as a result of being crowded, for example, in a small urban environment. And getting equine identification, the horse passports, is a common way in which we can potentially reach out to these people, and Stewart again has alluded to it, provide a channel of communication for getting either information to or an awareness of who these people are and where they are. So for me, communication is one of the key tools in terms of improving horse welfare. And so for us, having the Central Equine Database being populated accurately with owner, keeper, location, and more information about the horses is absolutely vital to us being effective. And we've already got a lot of examples of where we've been able to reunite owners with stray horses, and also follow up when we've had concerns for the welfare of horses by using the database. So basically, you just need to go out there now, get yourselves a software package from the interweb and build it, and all the horse owners will come rushing forward and want to stick their horses on, or will they? So maybe a couple of examples of where you least expect a database to dig you out of a hole and to be a real bonus to you and your horse. Coming back to the title of my talk. In 2015, Red Wings had an outbreak of strangles in its own herd, which wasn't really expected given that we have a very strict and effective quarantine system. We have been running a database at Red Wings since about 1998. And one of the reasons we had that was to be able to trace the movement of horses around the property. And the two horses, Cal and Smarty, were our index cases during the strangles outbreak. And we actually used the database to create this map of the contacts that they'd had directly and indirectly with every other horse in the sanctuary. And from there, we were able to manage our entire outbreak management program. Which areas we quarantined was entirely done off the back of confidence that within 24 hours, every horse's movement at Red Wings is updated onto our database. So we have an almost real-time movement record of our horses. And without that, our outbreak could have been disastrous. So for example, this farm where the outbreak started could potentially have over 450 horses on that site. We'd also had a lot of horses move on and off the farm in the weeks leading up to the first case. So we could have spread the disease not only around the farm, but also from that farm to our other sites. And at one stage, we had quarantine running on 4 different farms on multiple locations in each of those farms. And had we not had our database, we wouldn't have been able to bring the outbreak under control. So I think in the end, we had less than 35 horses come up with positive strangles that actually contracted the disease. And so we protected at least 400, if not 1,000 horses from strangles as a result of knowing where the horses had moved. Recently, there's also been a really good article where innovation is starting to drive databases seeping into the sort of horse owners' consciousness and being presented to them as a benefit to them rather than a legal requirement. So in Ireland, they've developed an app where they are linking the microchips that can sense body temperature in horses, so that you can increase your amount of information that you can get automatically about your horse's health using your access to the microchip linking to the database. So innovation built around what horse owners want and what horse owners need, but perhaps don't know that they want, I think is critical in order to help us get to that point where us as people passionate about horse welfare can have the tools to become more effective at what we're trying to do to not only stop suffering, but also improve basic standards of welfare. So I'm sorry, I think I've overrun, and my summary slide really hopefully will just capture the key points that I was trying to get across today. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. de Brauwere, for that fascinating presentation. As a thank you for speaking, the EIS has made a $50 donation to For the Herd in your name. Our final speaker of this evening is Kristy House. Kristy is the Manager of Welfare and Industry at Equestrian Canada and is a University of Guelph alumni. She's currently working on a project called the Equine Identification and Traceability and Animal Care Assessment Program with Equestrian Canada. So please help me in welcoming Kristy House.
Thank you very much. I think our first 2 speakers are the perfect segue into my presentation. I will try to stay in time. Thank you very much to all the speakers tonight, as well as to University of Guelph and everyone who put such a great effort into a wonderful event. I'm here to speak about the current realities in Canada, as well as what we're planning for the future. And let's just picture while I'm speaking through this presentation that that we had a wonderful system like Stewart's to support us through the endeavor. So a while ago, we have done an industry consultation, starting with committees and task force and focus groups, and developed the first draft of the Canadian Equine Identification Program, which would be phase 1 of 2 phases. So starting with consolidated and truant unified identification for equines in Canada, and then moving into full-scale traceability. So the total outline of the program had been consolidated and released out, and we did solicit feedback. It actually is still live on the website, and we're able to continue to take feedback. And then we released a what we heard document that outlined everything that we heard back from the industry. So first, I'm going to touch a bit on where we're at in terms of identification in Canada, and a little bit of where we need to be. So if we think about the common ways that you can identify an equine in Canada, we have microchips, we have brands, we have tattoos, we have breed registries, we have sport licenses, we have FEI registries, and everything in between. And then if we think about all the things that a horse can do in his lifetime, he can be in training, he can be a school horse, he could be a racehorse and an eventer, a jumper, back to breeding, retired. But where does all the information around all his different identities centralize and follow him through his life cycle? What could be wrong, right? So currently, we have a lot of paper-based, we have a lot of siloed identification databases around one horse. I want you to ask yourself a question. How many times have you received a horse or known a horse that you didn't know his history, his real name, his actual age, his pedigree, or his breeding? So we're dealing with issues of misrepresentation in sport, loss of information through multiple name changes, multiple ID documents like horse recordings and sport passports, and a decrease in confidence, most importantly, from our government, our foreign markets, but also lost opportunities in terms of branding and marketing those Canadian origin horses and supporting our breeding. What value would centralized identification bring to Canada? Well, I think we've heard a lot from our last two presenters in terms of ID and traceability and its value, but if we were to talk about some real life examples we've seen here, not only is it security and branding, but fair play and better business and less paperwork, but let's talk about when we experience wildfires in our Western provinces. If you are in emergency situations, do you have the means to identify and have proofs of ownership for a horse if it is located? We heard stories from incidents where horses were found a province or two over, but no real way of tracing where they came from, who they belong to, and then reuniting and verifying that that is the owner. Breed recognition is definitely an aspect. You know, we have export problems in terms of if a horse exports out of the US, then it's on North American passport and there's no way to recognize the truancy of where that horse came from. And then talking about history and improved background tracking and welfare. So what is the Canadian Equine Identification Program? Well, it's industry driven, not regulated, which is different from the other livestock species in the country, meaning that we are not currently required to have mandated identification and traceability for equines in Canada. That is the case today. I don't think that that would be the case forever, but that is where we're at. So we are looking to build or use a system that works for the industry first and meets all the regulatory expectations as an output. So phase one is what we're in right now, which is developing a program, developing a system, and acquiring the technology needed to support it. So we did go through an RFP process at Equestrian Canada looking for a system that could support all the aspirations of the identification program as well as the traceability program when we're moving into phase two. And I'm going to save the results of that RFP for a little bit later just to keep the excitement going. So a little bit about the who, what, when, how would this all work? How would it come together? So the program would be open to all equines in Canada. We've stolen bits and pieces of programs around the world in terms of what's working and what's not working and compiled it all together to see if we could come up with something that would work for everybody. So we, similar to some programs we see in the US, would have affiliated registries, which would act as dual recognition when a foal is registered with either the breed registry or the program. We would also have open registry for those that aren't affiliated with a registry or not part of a stud book that's available in Canada. And then what? So Stewart, you've heard both Stewart and Dan talk about the passport and the program. We've referred to it as an equine record, but essentially it would be the same thing. It will act as a verified identification document and serve as the formal registration to the Canadian Equine Identification Program. It's going to contain information about physical markings and identification, but also Canadian specific physical identifiers. So Equestrian Canada had worked with Canadian Food Inspection Agency in order to be able to distribute Canadian specific microchips. And what that means is that microchip is ISO part of the traceability program, and the range that's on the chip would start with Canada's country code, which is 124. So this would help to unify microchip distribution and avoid duplication of microchip numbers. It would also identify the premise where the horse is currently housed or where they're moving around, and then looking at in terms of equine right of buyback or addressing food chain status issues similar to what goes on in other countries. So where? The microchip can currently be applied most commonly in the nuchal ligament, but we have seen an industry shift, especially in the thoroughbred racing industry, to using the upper lip location. both have their benefits, but we are starting to see benefits to the upper lip location in terms of application as well as readability and its lack of migration compared to the nuchal ligament. It is a new procedure, so we're anxious to see how it works out, but it is very innovative, and it did originate in Canada. So registration of the foal would take place with the participating breed registry or stud book, and it would be a dual recognition as mentioned before. If it's not affiliated with the program, then you can have an independent passport issued through the program. All would be correlated in a central data platform or a central equine database. So essentially what we're talking about is that horse's nexus card, and similar to what Stewart had talked about, all that horse's relevant information would be centralized in one place and accessible in real time when it's needed. So what's next? And this is the exciting part. So the outcome of our RFP was to enter into a discovery contract with Equine Registered Stewart's Group. We will be working with a variety of different stakeholders, but some of the main ones being the national breed affiliates, the government, both federal, provincial, working with veterinarians, different user groups such as competition organizers, Equestrian Canada stakeholders, and our provincial counterparts. From there, we would develop a business rules document and a potential implementation plan. And then if all goes well and everything adds up, we'll be moving into full implementation of the system into Canada, including beginning the distribution of the Canadian specific microchips. So in the second part of my presentation, I'm going to talk about why this is all relevant. What is emergency preparedness and where are we at currently in that front? First up, I'll talk about disease emergency preparedness. Researchers at University of Guelph recently took some Equestrian Canada data and did a bit of an assessment in terms of biosecurity, and we did get some pretty astounding results. And I'm not going to try to get into fully describing it, but some of the common things that stuck out to me, and you have to remember this is just Equestrian Canada data. So for horses that were participating in our events to which we actually collect data for, where we know for two things, that horse could most definitely be doing activities outside of Equestrian Canada sanctioned activities, as well as there's a huge gap in the data that we actually track on horses right now. So 600 horses in the average show season in Ontario come in contact with each other. So one horse would be in contact with 600 other horses throughout the system. Most horses competing at gold level events or in multiple disciplines had high contact, but what was astounding was many disciplines also had cross-discipline contact based on what their home farm is, venues they've traveled to, and the turnover rate from there. So right now, I would say, given the lack of systems that we have in place, besides good biosecurity at competitions, the actual ability to trace back would be quite challenging given our current context. And just for a little bit of that fear factor, current impacts of disease outbreak around the world. There's some pretty astonishing numbers up on the screen here, but associated loss with an outbreak of influenza in Australia was $281 million and 65 million in horse businesses and 34 million in households. The value of horses reported that had died was close to 1 million, and despite the fact that it's uncommonly fatal. So it's just a little bit of a reality. Influenza is very common, and what the real potential could be, and I think we've gotten very lucky that we haven't experienced something with quite the same impact as that situation. So then if we take a look at if we have Stewart's system in place or a similar one, then we have a disease outbreak, we have a news alert, and we have the ability to shut down and to stop quickly and make sure that we're containing it as much as possible. The next emergency we can talk about is natural disasters. So how to appropriately prepare for evacuations, recovery efforts, financial aid, evacuation efforts. How do you communicate to everybody? How do you know the capacity of how many you could potentially be dealing with in terms of recovery efforts in the aftermath? How many are we looking for? How do we get to them? Where should they be? financial aid in terms of recouping? What is the financial amount that's needed in order to support the quantity of horses that have been impacted? All of this data is very hard to collect right now, and not to mention the communication system in order to communicate in real time and be effective and make sure we reach everyone would be pretty hard to deal with. And then let's talk about our current emergency, a global pandemic that threw things at us from the industry standpoint that we had never been able to prepare for. And a lot of the scenarios were a lot more difficult because we didn't have easy access to the information we need. So scenario number one, all the borders closed. We didn't have centralized data. So we have horses of Canadian origin and riders who need to get home quickly. The federal government wants to know how many horses there are, where they'll be crossing. We're trying to work with USDA to prep them, to understand how many potential health certificates and export papers we're going to need. So when we're having these conversations, the only response that I have is, well, I'm going to have to send out a survey and I'm going to need to get back to you in 48 to 72 hours. So if we think about the same exact situation, all we have to do is pull the report and we have all that information. We can communicate not only to the government, but out to the competitors and the people who are trying to get home with all the relevant information that they need to do it effectively. As well, that proof of vaccination, all of the import requirements required for those horses to get back into the country, very easy to access, a much more seamless process than the one we had to deal with in March. So let's talk about scenario number two. This is very real and this is still going on. So the equine industry has come to a screeching halt due to the requirements and the shutdowns around COVID-19. We hear that there's trouble on the ground. We need to help support the industry. We're trying to get financial recovery from the federal government. We're in conversations with them every day. The question comes up, how many horses? Where are they? What province? What kind of dollar value are you thinking? Okay, sir, just let me send out a survey. I should be able to get back to you in about 2 to 3 weeks, and we should have that number crunched in about 4, and then we'll continue these conversations about how much money we need. And then we reverse the scenario. All of a sudden, we have all the information we need. Within that 4 weeks, now we're into discussing exactly what we need, how to deploy it, where it needs to go, the financial impact of both receiving and not receiving. And we have much more data to play with in order to support the industry throughout this crisis. So I'd like to ask you and leave you with this question. What would the value of ID and traceability bring to you currently as a horse owner in Canada, a facility manager, a coach, a trainer, a breeder, and a professional? We want to hear from you, so please reach out to me at Equestrian Canada, and please, pay attention to communications, engagement opportunities, and become involved in the process of development as much as possible. And thank you very much for the time today.
Awesome. Thank you, Kristy. That was a very interesting presentation. And as a thank you for speaking, the EIS has made a $50 donation to For the Herd in your name.
Thank you.
We would once again like to thank all of our speakers for volunteering their time to share their knowledge and experience with us this evening. Traceability has always been a mystery topic to so many people, but today's presentations really helped to clarify its benefits and how it could be implemented in Canada, as well as internationally.
We will now open the Q&A session. If you have any questions, feel free to send them into the Q&A box and we'll get through as many as possible.
Our first question today is directed towards Stewart. So for many years, the main barrier to horse traceability in Canada has been the reluctance of governments to fund it. I understand that the Equine Register's predecessor, the National Equine Database, was shut down in 2012 due to government funding cuts. Are there any lessons for Canadians from that experience? Why did the UK government initially fund the National Equine Database? Why did it then withdraw funding? And why did it resume funding the Equine Register?
Whoa, that's a load of questions. Right, okay. So there's a whole load of history and politics here that I'll try and trot through really quickly for you. When the government shut down the previous National Equine Database, there wasn't a requirement to have a National Equine Database, and the government was going around cancelling anything that there wasn't a legal requirement for. Then the horse meat scandal happened. Then all hell broke loose, as you can imagine, and probably saw from the minimum safe distance of the other side of the Atlantic. And then the whole European thing changed and it became a requirement to have a central equine database. That's when we came in, and the government now in the UK funds having the central equine database part of it, just the CED part of those, all the applications. That's the bit that's funded by government, because that's the bit they have to provide by law. And they also get a ton of insight and data that they also need to report back to other government bodies and things like this. So that side of things is like that. I think your other question was about, did you say about how it's funded? I can't remember, or now, or how it would be funded.
Yeah, so how is it currently funded by, sorry, I have the question here.
Right, so government funds, in the UK, government funds the central equine database part, and there are a load of services. We operate a freemium model because we work with all the stakeholder groups. The whole way that the thing is structured is to have a sustainable business model. It is not about pumping in massive amounts of cash. It is not about big white elephant projects that are funded by government. This is about everyone microbilling, paying tiny parts, Amazon, Facebook, eBay, whatever you want to look at. It's that kind of vibe. Thousands of tiny payments, not some big payments. And the idea is that the cost savings that it makes industry, we can show that increases their profitability through streamlining a process, but also the freemium model means that people can use the system for free anyway, to an extent. And when they want to do the funky stuff, that's when they start paying a little bit of cash for it, whether it be in a microbilling pay-as-you-go or a subscription model. There are different ways that we're working in Canada at looking through the discovery process about how it's funded. But the most important thing is this doesn't become a burden to the public purse. It's just a choice in the UK that the government funds it. The government could not as well, but they have to because it's a legal requirement there. So it's a slightly different thing.
Perfect. Another question directed towards Stewart. Have you ever been approached to implement the traceability program in Australia?
So we've had tons of conversations with some really cool people from all over Australia, actually. But I believe there was a Senate report done a while ago, and there's a requirement in there, or a recommendation in there, that they talk to the UK about the central equine database and the traceability systems there. We're talking to people. We're happy to talk to the big program that's running out there now, that's just been implemented and started. Happy to talk to them at any point.
Awesome. I guess a kind of a question for Kristy and Stewart. Is the app that Stewart showed available in the US?
It's not available in the US, and we're going through the discovery phase in Canada at the second. Kristy, do you want to pick that up?
I mean, my answer is pretty similar to yours. It's not available in the US, and hopefully, if all things move well, it would be available in Canada.
Perfect. All right. So the next question, what are the registration costs for the UK or Canada systems, including ongoing maintenance costs or yearly fees per horse per owner or breed society, competition societies, etc., or access fees?
Wow. So the simple answer is that has not been defined yet, and that is a key outcome that we're looking for in the discovery phase of the with Equestrian Canada and Equine Register. I think Stewart went over the pricing model from a little bit, but obviously our intent is the same as the UK. Hopefully to have the cost of entering in and the stuff that's essential to horse welfare be minimum, as minimum as possible. And then when you're getting into more of the optional and value added for some of the recreational activities you engage in, that's where those minimal transactions would come in. So we're still mapping that out. We actually did do a market research project with University of Guelph students last year, which had some very good recommendations in terms of pricing of microchips and that kind of thing that's comparable to the US and other sectors in Canada. So we do have some good information, but that's going to be a key indicator that we're looking for when we come out of the discovery session.
I think just to add a little bit to that, whatever turns out needs to be, it mustn't be prohibitive, and it won't be prohibitive, otherwise it can't work. So the whole
That's
thing
right.
should be low touch and a not unpleasant experience financially. So otherwise it's pointless. So yeah.
Awesome. All right. And somebody asked, can you please expand on how this system works where internet or phone service is not available?
Yeah, it does. It's got some really, to be fair, it's got some really sophisticated online storage procedures and, offline storage procedures. That's exactly the wrong word. Not online, offline storage procedures that schedule things back. It's actually, to be fair, really clever. It's also, from a kind of development point of view, one of the least sexy jobs in development, because no one can actually see what you've done and you've been working on it for 6 months. But the guys have done it and it's awesome. And actually, it's absolutely critical to making the system work, because horses are in fields, not in offices. So, or at least they shouldn't be in offices. So you need to be able to go out there, and as you come in and out of mobile signal, cell coverage, you can do that. GPS works separately anyway, and it's really hard not to be in GPS cover. We can deal with that too, but actually that is pretty much there the whole time. So we work on a series of different networks that do different things, but it's unbelievably sophisticated, that piece of the technology.
Awesome. And kind of another Australia question. Somebody was wondering, where did you get the data for Australia that was quoted?
I guess that's you, Kristy.
Yeah. If that's related to the influenza outbreak, I do have the source in one of my files. So if you want to email me at khouse@equestrian.ca, I'm happy to share it. But I don't think it was anywhere overly complicated.
Awesome. I have another question here. This is for Kristy. So some of the traceability information you described as being useful to Equestrian Canada to make the case to government could also be collected through a comprehensive equine industry survey. But the last time Equestrian Canada carried out that kind of industry survey was 10 years ago in 2010. Why did they stop? And is EC planning to carry out a new comprehensive industry survey?
So great question. Absolutely, we are intending to carry out a survey. It's been identified as we're planning into the next 4-year cycle of strategic planning. I mean, I'm twofold on when we do it. We really need it, but also doing it ahead of having a system like Stewart's would be very onerous, there's a large margin for error, and we wouldn't be able to get the quality of data and the outcomes that we would if we did have a system in place. So that's where I'm twofold on it. I do think, if you can remember back to Bronwyn's survey or Bronwyn's presentation on Monday about the huge data gaps we currently have in terms of how many horses are in Canada, and the type of extensive surveying that would be required to actually have a valuable survey and a valuable output. We're trying to look at methodology that would be supported by technology and would give us a very comprehensive outcome that would be as accurate as humanly possible. So that's my roundabout answer, but it's definitely a priority. And with the implementation of a system and centralized data, it would be much easier to turn that 10-year cycle into an annual cycle or into a biannual cycle. So we are, it still is a priority. We actually did have discussions last year or the year before with the federal government about doing another survey, but have kind of landed on restructuring on the outcomes that we're looking for and making sure that we are going to be able to do it effectively.
Awesome. Another question for you, Kristy. So recently the racing industry changed to a chip identification. You mentioned that Equestrian Canada uses a pre-digit identification. Is this what the racing industry is using?
So currently, right now, they are not using them because of the agreement between Canadian Food Inspection Agency and Equestrian Canada. We actually are the only group that is able to distribute those 124 Canadian specific microchips. However, the three major breed registries that are involved in racing in Canada, which is Canadian Thoroughbred Horse Society, Standardbred Canada, and Canadian Quarter Horse Association, are all fully involved with the discovery process and looking at how they would integrate the use of the 124 chip should they choose to affiliate with the program. So these are all situations, while it is a voluntary program, and as I mentioned before, we don't currently have legislation in Canada that mandates the use of any specific chip, but we do have lots of value around using it, and that's what we're working on with the breed registries.
So another question, kind of just for either three of you to answer. Do you run into problems with people not wanting to participate due to fear of government control? This seems to be an issue in the US.
Yeah, we do. And the way to get, we found that there's kind of the big brother thing, but the way to get around that is to show people the value and show people that it's not a big brother thing. The other thing is that if you remember the diagram that I had there with the circles around the outside of it, essentially, if you think of that as a net, when animals pass through it, they become legalized, and then they're legalized in the system. And essentially, the way that it works is as people see the value and see what they can do, they come into the net voluntarily. More and more people grow, and eventually, there's just people left on the outside who can only trade and move and this and that with themselves. So the system just kind of picks people up as they see the value and see what it does for them on the ground to help them and their horses. That's the best way to approach it. And it also removes the kind of stigma of governments. We keep stuff separately. And weirdly, we also provide a service for the government where we redact stuff from the government independently as well in order for them to stay legal too. That's quite complicated, but it just goes to show. I don't know what it would be like in America. I've got no idea how that would work out there, but everyone's paranoid about different things. But if you show them the value and show what it does, people will use it.
Another question.
So if I just pick up on that, I think one of the things that's quite important to recognize is that Stewart can probably attest to this far more than me, but when we've been working to get this legislation from government so that we could have something like the CAED coming into existence, there's always going to be other lobbies that want things done differently or want to water it down. And the compromises can be quite damaging because you might get 90% of what you want, but the last 5% that you need, if that's denied to you, the whole system can come crumbling down. So an example in the UK is worked really hard to get on-the-spot fines for people that are non-compliant because quite a lot of the normal equestrian community are resistant and would potentially, until things like maybe being barred from getting into a horse show if they haven't got everything up to date. In the shorter term, we might find that actually a couple of short, sharp shocks with on-the-spot fines might be needed. But the system, as it's ended up being developed, is quite cumbersome. And so the watering down process has actually damaged the integrity of the ability to do those immediate interventions. So I think when anything is being developed, I think it's really important to think about whether or not the compromises you're making are damaging to what you're going to have. Because ultimately, I think Stewart said this a few times, it's got to be affordable. It has to have a perceived value for the benefit someone gets from it. And it's got to be quite easy. And I think one of our big challenges in the UK is the ease with which owners can update when they've sold a horse or bought a horse. And I think those systems, correct me if I'm wrong, Stewart, but they could be done very easily, but the sort of dragging of the heels by various quarters, not just government, have made it more difficult for the system to be as smooth as it could be.
It's taken a long time, and it's also a constant myth busting and fog busting and God knows whatever else busting. But those systems are now available on the market and now starting to get big traction, and also starting to show people that actually the system protects them, it protects their industries, it's not taken away from them. It's a positive thing, and there's information that can be given back to show how it works and how it drives positive change on the ground for horses and people. So it's just a slow burn that you've got to stick with.
Awesome. Okay, I have another question for Kristy. Would the registry in Canada include horses in rescue or seizure situations? Would rescues and sanctuaries be required to register with Equestrian Canada if they aren't already?
So I think definitely in terms of, we're speaking from a voluntary standpoint right now, because in Canada, that's where we're at. So nobody could be required unless that was a mandate that was put down either by the government or by Humane Canada or SPCAs or whichever. But I don't see why valid and truant rescues and sanctuaries wouldn't want to participate and provide that transparency as well as that security, so that they could access the benefits in terms of rehoming and trust and truancy going forward.
Awesome. Another question for you, Kristy. Would the centralized equine database replace the FEI horse passport system?
It wouldn't be replacing it. So if you think about that Nexus card slide, it would be one of the things in that horse's wallet. So the FEI passport, given that FEI, you know, currently is still working on a paper-based system, but if they were, it would definitely hold that information. But it would be in addition to whatever that horse has, and I'll use the metaphor, their Apple wallet. It would be centralized there.
Awesome. Okay. Another question for you, Kristy. What is the intention for those horses who are already microchipped for sport, for example, FEI? Will these be somehow grandfathered into the new Canadian initiative, or will those horses be required to have new or additional microchips?
So I think certainly, and this has definitely been the tone through the conversation with the breed registries, but we would for sure be looking at a grandfathered period, which is very common even in the other livestock sectors with their identification means. So the one thing we surely want to avoid, and is the entire purpose of having centralized distribution and unified microchips, is having duplicate microchips, because it really gets in the way of having that central source of truth for that horse's identity. However, if somebody did want to have the Canadian specific microchip, or there was an issue where their microchip was lost, that there definitely would be the opportunity to list multiple microchips on that horse's data. But moving forward, we would think at a certain point in time, any full-born or horse registered to the program that is not previously microchipped would be with that Canadian specific chip.
All right, I have another one here. So this is kind of just for anyone. Is there any alternative practical identification process that could be used with an electronic database other than a microchip?
So I think that may be a better question for Stewart, but not that I'm aware of. I mean, it's ever evolving for sure, and I'm sure one day there's going to be an addition or something, but I'll leave that to Stewart to answer.
So we support, I mean, I think chipping's great. Chipping works really well, remember, when you've got it linked to a central database, because unless you've got it linked and registered to a central database, sounds like I'm stating the obvious, but you would be amazed how few people think the process through. If you don't register the chip number to a central database and have the ability to pull that information back, all you've got is a chip number, which is almost, but not quite entirely useless. So it's all part of the same thing, but the system, our system itself will record brands, freeze brands, acquired marks, markings, whorls, ermines, walleyes, the whole 9 yards. We do everything on there. You can throw what you like in there to identify your animal. And actually there's some quite cool stuff that can be done with reverse lookup of markings, a bit like a biometric fingerprint. That's starting to come in the future. So there's some really cool stuff, but the microchip is a key, easy, low cost, low hanging fruit kind of place to start with this, especially tied in with the applications and the ability to get that data really fast running backwards and forwards. The other thing that you can do is make sure the microchips aren't cloned or copied or whatever by scanning before you insert it, giving the vets the opportunity or the agents the opportunity to scan it to check it's not already in use. These are really important things to do to make the system work well.
Perfect. All right. I have one final question here for Dr. de Brauwere. Have you ever seen a situation where owners have given up their horses due to the enforcement of traceability? And do you think this poses a risk to welfare?
No, I think we've experienced resistance to that, but we see all kinds of conversations that happen around that you can take people in the right direction. So it just keeps coming back to that concept of perceived benefit. So recently we had a horse turn up at our sanctuary. She was running loose on the roads, and a colleague went and found it and put it on one of our fields. The owner was picked up. Within 5 minutes, we'd scanned the horse. Within 5 minutes, we'd found their details and phoned the number. They phoned back 10 minutes later and arranged to come fetch the horse. The horse was only from about 5 kilometers away, but it had actually gone in the opposite direction first. So potentially would have been involved in a couple of car accidents. It's an older horse, and she had decided that she probably didn't need to do this, even though the law change is now coming in, that it's compulsory to have your horses chipped. She thought that the horse would probably get put down before anyone would really need it. And she just decided she would do it because probably it's better to be on the right side of the law. And that was only a few weeks before we reunited her with the horse within 10 minutes effectively of finding it. So those stories aren't all that common, but when they happen, they are really powerful examples. We've mostly had people wonder what it's all about. And this comes from both the established horse sectors, the kind of old guard, if you want to call them that. Stewart will vouch for this, that if you want to have an hour's break from a Zoom meeting, you just start the discussion on equine passports and you can switch your camera off and disappear. And you'll come back and they'll still be at it and they won't even notice you've left. But I think gradually people are starting to see that it has benefits in so many different directions, that somewhere in there is something for them. And even the resistant group that we expected, which is the nomadic population, the gypsy traveler population, simply accept it as a necessity now because buying and selling is part of what they do, and they realize it's going to get very difficult to have legal transactions. So I have actually yet to come across someone who has thrown their arms in the air and said, here, have the horse. It's more likely that what we've had is horses abandoned by notorious troublemakers prior to getting the horses chipped, or getting them chipped but then not registering them on the database. And one of the most notorious abusers of animals here was actually prosecuted because there was a bill of sale that linked him to the microchips. So although he chipped the horses illegally himself, he purchased the chips and we could link him to the animals in that way, despite the fact that, yes, there were no vets involved and he hadn't put them on the database. So he was chipping them to minimize the risk to getting caught when someone would come and check the horses. He had his stories about why they didn't perhaps have the documents up to date. And then he would get the documents on the database at the point of selling the horses. So he operated a very clever scam, but eventually that did catch up with him too. So yeah, I think lots of problems, but generally the one that you alluded to is the one that I think I've not expected and so far not seen.
Perfect. All right. And with that, I will wrap up the Q&A and pass the MC on to Caitlin.
Perfect. Thank you everyone for your wonderful questions, and apologies if we were unable to answer your question. As we wrap up, we would like to let you know about our feedback survey. The link to the feedback survey will be sent to you via email after our final session on Friday. To help us evaluate our event performance and continue to improve the symposium in the future, we ask that you fill out our feedback survey. Completion of the feedback survey will also gain you another raffle ticket. We would love any and all comments and feedback.
We would also like to take this opportunity to thank the amazing businesses and organizations that donated prizes for this event. We had 15 organizations and businesses who donated prizes for our EIS raffle. Without them, our raffle wouldn't happen. Their support for the Equine Industry Symposium is extremely valued. A reminder that the winners of the raffle draw will be emailed after Monday, November 23rd.
We would also like to remind you about For the Herd. If you're interested in donating to this emergency fundraiser campaign, you can use the link you see on screen. If you remember, if you provide your email, you will also be getting another raffle ticket.
Finally, we would also like to remind you that there is still one more day of the symposium. Tomorrow is the final day where we'll be discussing pandemic positives and silver linings. You can attend the Friday session using the same Zoom link that you used this evening. It will begin at the same time of 7 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
So thank you everyone for attending and making the 2020 Equine Industry Symposium such a success. We'll look forward to seeing you again tomorrow for our final session on Friday. Thank you all again.
Thank you.